the 12th day of May, 2025. Welcome to all of you who are participating. In today's program, I'm glad to have you here. Lots of things have occurred over the last few days of great significance in the sense of world peace, the chance for world peace, and the development, the further development of a security architecture in Europe, and hopefully some visible end to the genocide in the Middle East. Now, in the follow-up to, I know a lot of you have been following what's been going on with the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. And it's the celebration here on the 9th. I guess it was Friday. Yeah, Friday was the 80th anniversary of the end of, essentially the end of World War II. And I didn't see a whole lot of that in this country. I saw very little celebration in this country regarding that, but lots of celebration in various parts of Europe, especially in Russia, which was the end of the Great Patriotic War. So in the follow-up to the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow, and I'm gonna spend some time on this, because this is, I feel it's very important that the truth of this, of what happened in World War II, is clearly well understood. So with the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow, Russian President Vladimir Putin held meetings Saturday with the leaders of Vietnam, Burkina Faso, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, as well as with the commander of the Libyan National Army. And then at the end of the day on May 11th, which was Sunday, he held a press conference and he noted that the foreign leaders who attended the Victory Day celebrations particularly thanked those who attended. So despite the pressure from certain countries to boycott this event, and I'll get into who those countries are, he stressed the meeting that he and Chinese President Xi Jinping had held and that the agreements that they had signed between them. Putin also emphasized that the issue of the Ukraine conflict had also been a topic of those discussions, and Putin remarked that Ukraine had rejected all the proposals that Russia had put forward, which was the 30-day moratorium back in March on attacks on each other's energy facilities, the Easter truce, and now the 3-day Victory Day truce. And he later pointed out that Ukraine had planned drone attacks on Moscow on Victory Day, but they had been thwarted by Russia's aerospace forces, and as were the several attempts of Ukrainian forces to overrun the Russian border back in Kursk and Belgorod regions, as some kind of an insane attempt to keep this war going. Putin then announced that he was calling for the beginning of peace talks with Ukraine to take place May 15th in Istanbul in order to continue what was interrupted by the Ukraine back in April of 2022. Putin's move fundamentally undercuts the demand by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, remember he just got in there, on a second vote. It's been a long time since a chancellor has been elected in Germany, and it took the second vote to do it. And French President Macron and UK Prime Minister Starmer and Poland's President Tusk and Ukraine's perennial clown Zelensky for a 30-day truce. And Putin indicated that the Turkish side had said that they would be willing to host such talks. President Erdogan has been working for some time for this to occur. And Putin said this. He said, "Let me reiterate myself. Russia is ready for talks without any preliminary conditions. There are combat actions and war going on right now, and we propose to resume negotiations that were not interrupted by us." So what's wrong about that, he says. He said, "Those who really want peace cannot but support this. And at the same time, I would like to express my gratitude once again for the mediation services and efforts aimed at the peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian crisis undertaken by our foreign partners, including China, Brazil, African countries, the Middle East, and recently the new administration of the United States of America. So after a call with Putin, Erdogan began getting on the phone with world leaders to discuss the issue, and he said Ankara would do everything possible in organizing and carrying out the discussions that could lead to a stable peace. Now, in contrast to this, the media hype, and I saw this over the weekend, that U.S. President Donald Trump is supporting the European plan. Trump expressed clear support for Putin's proposal and told the Ukrainians that they should accept Putin's proposal immediately. Now, you follow that? At the same time, the U.S. press, and embarrassingly so Fox News, announcing that Trump was supporting the European plan of this ridiculous demand on Russia that Russia will never accept. Trump was coming out and say, wait a minute. He comes out and he says this on Truth Social over the weekend. President Putin of Russia doesn't want to have a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine. He wants to meet on Thursday in Turkey to negotiate the end of this bloodbath. Ukraine should agree to this immediately. At least they'll not be able to determine whether or not a deal is possible. And if it's not, European leaders and the U.S. will know where everybody stands and can proceed accordingly. I'm starting to doubt that Ukraine will make a deal with Putin, who's too busy celebrating the victory of World War II, which could not have been won without the United States of America. Have the meeting now. So Zelensky could hardly refuse the demand from the President of the United States, so he tweeted a challenge to Putin to, to meet him in Turkey on May 15th. Also the birthday of Israel, mind you. A challenge to meet acting President Zelensky in Turkey. For crying out loud. So those not beholden to the mainstream media, and therefore people like you, my stream audience and K-Talk audience that are still capable of thinking, didn't fail to recognize the flank that was executed by President Putin on the Five Stooges. Starmer, Macron, Zelensky, Merz, and Tusk, only hours after their meeting last week and their ultimatum. And Lieutenant Colonel Danny Davis posted Zelensky and the European Union's counteroffer. They said, we propose to Kyiv authorities to resume the talks that they stopped in April of 2022. I'm referring to direct talks without any preconditions. And we start immediately next Thursday on the 15th of May in Istanbul. So if you had Zelensky saying, well, I demand an immediate ceasefire tomorrow, and Putin says, well, how about we just resume the talks that you stopped from Istanbul? How about this Thursday? How about we start with that? At the same time, Zelensky saying, no, I demand an immediate 30-day ceasefire. So, well, I honestly have to give it to Putin on this case, because he's a lot more composed, I think, than I would have been. Because Putin has the dominant hand, because Putin has won the war. I mean, he could have just said, hey, you know what? You know what, acting President Zelensky? Why don't we just forget about all this? Let's just forget everything we've been talking about. Let's forget about negotiations. We'll just meet you in Kyiv on the battlefront like we met Germany in Berlin. But he was unequivocal. He says there will be no 30-day ceasefire. He's been unequivocal. He's been unequivocal on this from the very beginning. And in that same press conference that Putin made there yesterday, he also explained what his intent was. Not for a 30-day ceasefire, but to end the war. So the Duran's Alexander Mercouris said on his webcast Sunday, I think, he said, what we also saw yesterday was what tends to happen when a bunch of amateurs, which is what the leaders of the European states and Volodymyr Zelensky basically are, what happens when amateurs who feel very pleased with themselves and imagine themselves to be extremely clever people come up against a consummate and massively experienced professional. Over the last, Mercouris goes on here, over the last couple of days, Putin has been, even by his standards, incredibly busy. Since the 7th of May, he's been hosting a whole large group of world leaders led by the president of Cuba, 29 world leaders in total, as well as various other important foreign guests. He's had to engage in long and detailed discussions with President Xi Jinping of China, a leader with an extraordinary mastery of detail, at least as equal to Putin's own. He had to conduct negotiations with the president of Brazil, President Lula. And of course, President Lula also came with a very strong delegation. He's also had to meet with other leaders, Serbian President Alexander Vučić, Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico, and the presidents of Egypt and Ethiopia and all sorts of other countries. He's had to attend a parade in Moscow. He had to host leaders and Russian citizens in various ceremonies conducted mostly in the Kremlin. He's also had to participate, if only for a brief time, in the March of the Immortal Regiment. This is the regiment, the march of Russian citizens, holding pictures of their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers who fought in the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War. And he also had to engage in various other things that the president of Russia has to do in order to govern that enormous country. And yet, notwithstanding that, notwithstanding the fact that yesterday was dedicated to meeting foreign delegations, despite the fact that he had a long meeting with a strong delegation from Vietnam, he conducted a long and detailed discussion with them far into the night. And despite all of that, at 2 o'clock in the morning, he came looking fresh and incisive, met with the media, and responded to the ultimatum Russia received from the West. And though he was careful to take no questions and admitted that both he and everyone else in the room was tired, nonetheless, he gave an accomplished performance, very clear in all the things he wanted to say, and very much to the point, as I said, putting the Western powers in a position that they didn't expect to be in earlier over the course of the day. It was a virtuoso performance, and it's a sign again of Putin's extraordinary physical stamina and tremendous intellectual energy that he was able to pull off something like that. Then President Trump, on his Truth Social account, President Putin of Russia doesn't want to have a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, but rather wants to meet on Thursday in Turkey to negotiate the end of this bloodbath. Ukraine should agree to this immediately. This is President Trump. At least they will be able to determine whether or not a deal is possible, and if it's not, European leaders and the U.S. will know where everything stands and can proceed accordingly. I'm starting to doubt that Ukraine will make a deal with Putin. And speaking purely in terms of poker or chess, there was absolutely no one with any doubt about who came out the winner in terms of the political exchanges yesterday. And the answer to is obviously President Putin of Russia. There was no contest whatsoever. And then I was going to mention Pope Leo XIV's his Sunday address to 100,000 people, Catholic, non-Catholic, that were gathered there at St. Peter's Square. I've been there twice. This is St. Peter's Cathedral is something to behold. Someone asked me the other day, because I've been to Italy at least two times, maybe three if I go back far enough, what I liked the best about Italy. And, well, it's Florence. If I were to go back and spend a week anywhere in Italy right now, it would be in Tuscany. And I would spend a week in Florence because of what you can see. Not Rome. You can see Rome in a day and a half. You spend a half a day seeing St. Peter's, and if you go to Rome, you have got to see St. Peter's. Hundreds of years in construction, just massive, probably, it may well be, because I've never been in the Pentagon, it may well be the largest building I've ever been in. Although they got something playing at K-Talk. Although the building at Cape Canaveral, Cape Kennedy, that finishes the rocket, where the rocket's finally assembled. That's a pretty big building, too. But so who cares? I'm just saying, I started off, I went out in the weeds terribly there, that Pope Leo addressed 100,000 people, and he's calling for the end of the war, of course. He's calling for the end of genocide and for the conflict in the Ukraine, all of this to end. Speaking on the realm of humanitarianism, and I didn't hear it. I read some of the translation. It was very impressive. I think God has given us a good pope so far. I liked about half of what Pope Francis did. The other half I didn't. I'm not Catholic, but well, there's something happening at K-Talk. Anyway, I want to go on here. So Witkoff, President Trump's special envoy Stephen Witkoff, perhaps speaking on behalf of the president, criticized Netanyahu's decision to continue the military operations in Gaza. And according to, I need to look at my notes here, sorry, because of what is playing at K-Talk. And so I try not to walk over that. I try to, keep things clear as to what's going on. It's like trying to ride two horses. So anyway, according to Israeli media, Witkoff said that he was opposed to Israel's continuation of the war in Gaza. He said, Israel is prolonging this war, even though we do not see where further progress can be made. And this was reported by Times of Israel. Still, there is currently a window of opportunity that we hope Israel and all the mediators will take advantage of. We're putting pressure on all the mediators and doing everything to return the hostages. So Times of Israel further quoted the Israeli officials as responding, if there are no agreements by the end of U.S. Donald Trump's visit to the Middle East on May 13th to 15th, Israel will launch a ground operation, and it will take several weeks until the next exit point. Once we've begun the intensified operation, we won't agree to quickly halt it. Hamas will not determine the timeline. And the same sources are reporting that Witkoff is talking with various key players last night, hoping to find a framework to the agreement. All right, now, some more on the Ukraine here, because this is a very important week. And then I want to get into the 80th anniversary commemorations. Because, if for no other reason, I want to be able to correct President Trump's understanding of history. So the French President Macron, Germany's Chancellor Merz, Great Britain's Prime Minister Starmer, together with Poland's Prime Minister Tusk, traveled to Kyiv, and this was yesterday, to meet with the failed comedian and acting president of Ukraine, Zelensky. And they tried unsuccessfully to upstage the Victory Day celebrations for the 80th anniversary of the defeat of fascism occurring throughout Russia and other nations. And they may have helped to divert attention from the coverage of the events in Moscow, or to change the subject by proposing a Monday morning 30-day ceasefire or else. Or else what? I mean, for at least of all the Russians made the mistake of taking them seriously. For example, Merz, having just squeezed through an election in as German chancellor, announced that he would call Russian President Putin to ask him to accept a 30-day ceasefire, no matter how many times Putin has said, And at the same time, he proposed that Putin would also have to be tried for war crimes. He said this in the same announcement. I'm going to call President Putin and ask for a 30-day ceasefire. And at the same time, we'll be discussing charging him with war crimes. And as the American commentator, Lieutenant Colonel Danny Davis, said, they're putting conditions even on the talks that they know the Russian side will never agree to. Merz, the new chancellor for Germany, was the most acidic. He said that any kind of end-of-war negotiations will have to include war crimes tribunal for Putin. Now, what head of state wouldn't just embrace the heck out of that? He says, yes, from a position of strength, I'm going to say, sure, we'll have end-of-war negotiations on terms you set that are beneficial to you, and that'll include me in prison after the war. So while President Vladimir Putin clearly rejected the 30-day ceasefire measure once again, there's also a question as to why and whether he would even consider a phone call from Merz of being any significance, even whether he would accept such a call, given the expansive rearmament proposals and the belligerent statements of the new German chancellor, because he's one of the ones who are pushing for Germany to rearm, to be ready for war with Russia in 2029. He's the one who is pushing the movement of all kinds of funds in the German budget away from social concerns and needs to war-making capabilities, building tanks. Even Volkswagen has turned over one of its manufacturing plants from cars to tanks. So Trump had supported the call of these three stooges, and Britain's Keir Starmer, not to be outdone, reportedly said that he would only accept a peace that met his conditions. So Davis, in his article, pointed to the stark reality, however. Right now, he said, we need to say it's time to stop the killing, which is what Trump has been saying all along. Because wisdom tells you that when you've been beat, let's keep it at a defeat and not destruction, and that's where we're at. Will the Ukraine side, with their Western enablers, especially in Europe, will they acknowledge and accede to a defeat, or do they demand destruction? Because that's where this is heading, folks. That's the reality. The hardcore reality of what we're facing here, despite all the big hugs and all the talk of unity among those four Western leaders, that's the reality. All the smiles and everything are hiding that they are leading. Ukraine and Zelensky is a willing participant in that to their own destruction. So a number of statements by European visitors to the Victory Day celebration. And again, the Victory Day celebration was going on for several days. And the high point, of course, was Friday. But it went through yesterday, celebrating the end of World War II, but not just the end of World War II. It was supposed to have been the end of fascism. So while they were pulling out the statements of historical leaders of Europe during the celebration, one was a statement of Pierre de Gaulle, the grandson of French President Charles de Gaulle, who attended the parade. And Charles de Gaulle had countered the Cold War narrative when he called for a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. And this was a wonderful day and great joy, Pierre de Gaulle said. And again, this is the grandson of Charles de Gaulle. We celebrate the end of the Second World War together with the Chinese, together with all the former Soviet republics, together with the Russians. This is a celebration for peace, and I hope that we will achieve peace. We all want peace. Another comment came from Alexander von Bismarck, the great-grandson of the first chancellor of the German Empire, Otto von Bismarck, who also attended the celebration. And Otto von Bismarck had kept the peace in Europe by maintaining the alliance between Germany and Russia, which successfully prevented the British Empire's attempts to have wars in Europe, which of course finally happened. He says, I think it's crazy when Brussels says we can't negotiate. Every person from Western Europe can come whenever they want. Doesn't matter. I invited many Germans to come here, and also the government. I believe that Germany, especially Germany, could be the best example of how to put diplomacy first. Let's all sit down at the negotiating table. Well, these statements serve as living historical reminders, bringing to mind the too often quoted but true observation of American philosopher George Santayana, who said those who can't remember the past, of course, are condemned to repeat it. So while the British, and I can't do a catch-up show like this without mentioning the Brits, while they like to point out that they did not practice segregation of African troops in their deployment during the Second World War, as did our American allies, there is a far more uncomfortable reality that perfidious Albion prefers to suppress. An essay, Africa and Britain During the Second World War, written at Flange Park High School in Rochdale, UK, reports that more than 1.3 million African soldiers fought for Britain and its allies in World War II. From 1939, hundreds of thousands of West African soldiers were sent to fight on the front lines in Europe. Although much is not known about their contributions, many Africans were conscripted by their colonial ruler, Britain, to fight in World War II. They were instrumental in bringing an end to the war, which was fought across Africa, Europe, and the East. Much is not known about their contributions. 80 years later, why is that? Were there any ceremonies held in London this week, or encouraged by King Charles throughout the Commonwealth for this 80th anniversary? Was there any proclamation issued? Why not, you might ask? Then again, perhaps you shouldn't. So while all this celebration was going on in many countries, especially Russia, England was silent. So on May 8th, last Thursday, Germany's Deutsche Welle news agency, a platform of 5.3 million subscribers, ran an interview with the British author Barnaby Phillips, who wrote Another Man's War, the story of a Burma boy in Britain's forgotten African army. And the reporter began pointing out, quote, it's worth remembering that back then nearly all of the continent was colonized by 5 European countries, Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, and Belgium. Only Egypt, Ethiopia, and Liberia were nominally independent. More than half of the colonial troops were enlisted by Britain. The 11th East Africa Infantry Division was made up of soldiers from the modern-day nations of Kenya, Uganda, Malawi, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. The division fought with the British Army in Burma, now Myanmar, about the complex reality of colonials fighting in a war against tyranny for the greater glory of the same British Empire that refuses them independence and self-government. He points out, let's not forget, Michael, of course, that many of these countries in Africa quite quickly after the Second World War became independent. That had not been envisioned by the British. Envisaged. It was necessarily envisaged within the societies. And then this group of large ex-servicemen who had fought for the British Empire were an anomaly, embarrassing at best, a threat, a potential threat at worst. So it's a very complex situation. Talking about, and it just comes down that it indicates that the role is indeed known, the memories are available to be collected, the resurrection of the aspirations of a generation of African leadership who participated in the Bandung Conference of 1955 should be seen from the standpoint of the events that ended only 10 years earlier. The days of the neat, antiseptic narratives of history, if the global South and indeed people of goodwill everywhere have anything to say about it, are and should be over. But Britain always liked to point out the fact that the United States held on to slavery longer than they did, and that while we would not let black soldiers be in the same platoons, divisions with the white soldiers in World War II, they never had that problem. Yet when the history comes out, it's a different matter. All right. Let me go on here. I want to get into I wasn't going to do this, but I think I will. This is a comment of I want to read portions of Putin's speech. portions of his speech at the celebrate the victory of the Great Patriotic War. And in addition to his thanks to the millions of citizens who served Russia and saved Russia from the world of fascism, Putin counters the disgusting effort in the West to leave out Russia's role in that victory by thanking those in the West who opened the second front in Europe, as well as the huge Chinese contribution in the war against Japan. Now, I want to kind of set the stage here. If you went out on the street today, in whatever town you live in, I live in Draper, and you go to the shopping areas where there's lots of people walking around, and you ask them who won World War II, they'll probably tell you the United States did, or at least the Allies. If you ask them what role Russia played in World War II, I think some of them have a hard time equating Russia with World War II. If you ask them what was the role that China played in the defeat of the Japanese, where were the Chinese battles? Where did the Chinese, and when were they able to start pushing back the Japanese invasion into China? I think they would have a hard time answering that question. Now, if they're under the age of 35, if you even ask them who were the Axis powers in World War II, I don't know that the majority of them could properly answer that question. Who were the major players in the Allied efforts to defeat Nazism? They could probably, maybe England, United States, France. What role did Spain play in World War II? The reason why I'm asking this is I'm trying to set the stage here for Putin's speech at the Victory Day celebration. And I know I'm not supposed to read stuff at length, and this isn't all that long, just a few minutes. But I think it's very important because it helps to understand the Russian position in all of this, especially Putin. He said this: veterans, guests, comrades, soldiers and sailors, sergeants and sergeant majors, midshipmen and warrant officers, comrade officers, generals and admirals, I congratulate you on the 80th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War. Today we are all unified by the feelings of joy and grief, pride and gratitude, and admiration for the generation that crushed Nazism and won freedom and peace for all humanity at the cost of millions of lives. We faithfully preserve the memory of those historic, glorious events. As the heirs of the victors, today we celebrate Victory Day as the most important holiday for our country, which the entire nation, each family, each of us holds dear. Our fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers saved the fatherland, and they bequeathed to us to defend the motherland, to stay united and firmly defend our national interests, our 1,000-year history, culture, and traditional values, everything that is dear to us, that is sacred to us. We remember the lessons of World War II and will never agree with the distortion of those events or attempts to justify the murderers or slander the true victors. Our duty is to defend the honor of the Red Army soldiers and commanders and the heroism of fighters of different ethnic backgrounds who will forever remain Russian soldiers in the world history. Russia has been and will continue to be an indestructible obstacle to Nazism, to Russophobia and anti-Semitism, and we will stand in the way of the violence perpetrated by the champions of these aggressive and destructive ideas. Truth and justice are on our side. The whole of Russia, our society, all people support the participants in the special military operation, and we're proud of their courage and spirit and their steely determination that has always brought us victory. Friends, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the enemy's most savage and relentless assaults. Millions of people, once devoted solely to peaceful labor, took up arms and stood firm to the death of every hill, bridgehead, and defensive line. The outcome of the Second World War was determined by decisive victories in major battles of Moscow and Stalingrad, on the Kursk Bridge and the Dnieper River by the courage of the defenders of Belarus, who were the first to face the invader, by staunch resistance at the Brest Fortress and the Mogilev, Odessa, Sevastopol, Murmansk, Tula, and Smolensk, by the heroism of the residents of besieged Leningrad, by the bravery of all those who fought on the front lines, in partisan units and in the underground resistance, as well as by selfless efforts of those who evacuated plants and factories under enemy fire and who worked on the home front, giving everything they had, working to the limits of their ability. The Nazis' plans to conquer the Soviet Union were shattered by the unshakable unity of the nation. The heroism of the Soviet people was common, and every republic shouldered the shared immense burden of war. The contribution of the peoples of Central Asia and South Caucasus was immense. From these regions came a steady flow of trains delivering everything the front needed. Hospitals were established. Hundreds of thousands of evacuees found a second home there. They were offered shelter, food, and heartfelt compassion. We honor every veteran of the Great Patriotic War and bow our heads in remembrance of all those who gave their lives for victory, the sons, the daughters, fathers, mothers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, loved ones and friends. We bow our heads before our fallen comrades in arms who laid down their lives as heroes in the righteous battle for Russia. Let us now observe a moment of silence. Nearly 80% of the world's population were drawn into the fiery orbit of World War II. The complete defeat of Nazi Germany, militarist Japan, and their satellites around the world was achieved through the combined efforts of the Allied nations. We will never forget that the opening of the Second Front in Europe, which took place after the decisive battles in the territory of the Soviet Union, hastened victory. We highly appreciate the contribution made to our common struggle by the Allied armies, the members of the resistance and courageous people of China, and all those who fought for a peaceful future. We will continue to look up to our veterans, taking example from their wholehearted love of the motherland and commitment to defending our homeland and the values of humanism and justice. We will give these traditions and this great heritage the biggest place in our heart, and will pass them to future generations. We will always rely on the unity in battle and in peaceful endeavors, in striving for strategic goals and tackling problems for the benefit of Russia and its greatness and prosperity. Glory to the victorious nation. Happy holiday, happy Victory Day, hurrah. And then the mob shouting hurrah. Now, this is President Trump's proclamation. He delivered the following proclamation on Friday, and it's posted to the White House website. It says this: by the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. Today, our nation proudly commemorates the 80th anniversary of the Allied powers' triumph over National Socialism and fascism and the end of World War II, one of the most epic victories by forces of freedom in the history of the world. On this Victory Day for World War II, we celebrate the unmatched might, strength, and power of the American Armed Forces, and we commit to protecting our sacred birthright of liberty against all threats, foreign and domestic. Now, there's more of this, but during Putin's speech that I was reading, he recognized the creation of a second front, which of course was D-Day. But that's June of 1944. Stalingrad was in 1941, 3 years earlier. Here's a little trivia fact that I didn't know till I read the stats. If you've ever seen the movie Enemy at the Gate, and as I checked out the fact checkers on it, it's a pretty accurate movie. Vasily Zaitsev was the was the sniper whose abilities at sniping against German officers was unmatched and was able to raise the morale of the Russians who were being killed every time, like, flies in a furnace by the entrenched Nazi troops. And if you haven't seen that movie, I think you should. It just tears at your heart. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this, that battle only lasted a few months. There were more Russians excuse me. There were more Russians killed in those few months in the Battle of Stalingrad than the combined deaths of all of the American and British troops the entire World War II. From the earliest days of England's involvement before the United States got involved in December of 41, all the way up through the summer of 45 when World War II was finally over. Of all, there's something like a little over 400,000 American deaths in the Pacific and European theaters, and a significant number of British deaths, not nearly as much, of course. What happened in a few months at Stalingrad was twice as many Russian deaths. I didn't know that till I started looking into the history of this, and it really impressed me. Anyway, back to President Trump's comments here. In the wake of December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States righteously entered the fray of what would become the apex of the eternal battle of good and evil. After nearly 4 years of the darkest and bloodiest chapters ever recorded in human history, more than 250,000 Americans lost their lives in the fight against the Nazi regime. Today and every day we pay tribute to all those who made the ultimate sacrifice for their nation, their liberty, and the survival of Western civilization. Without the sacrifice of our American soldiers, this war would not have been won, and our world today would look drastically different. May 8th, 1945 marks the Allies' acceptance of Germany's unconditional surrender, the beginning of the end of years of long, gruesome, brutal warfare. The millions of souls seamlessly lost served as a reminder of why we must pursue peace through strength. I remain steadfastly devoted to stopping the years of endless foreign wars and preventing the further loss of lives. As I stated during my inaugural address, we will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but by the wars we end. And my proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker. As we commemorate Victory Day for World War II, we offer our unending thanks to every patriot from the greatest generation who left behind his home and family to fight for our freedom in distant lands. We honor the memories of all those who perished. Above all, we renew our commitment to keeping America and the entire world safe, secure, prosperous, and free. Now, therefore, I, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution and the laws of the United States, do hereby proclaim May 8th, 2025 as a day of celebration of Victory Day for World War II. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand the 7th day of May, in the year of our Lord 2025, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 249th. There were a couple of things left out of that proclamation. Do you know why D-Day worked? And remember Eisenhower's comments? Remember how Eisenhower had already written a speech to be released to the press in case D-Day didn't work? And his serious, heartfelt apologies for the death of the Americans and Allied soldiers involved in that great invasion of Normandy should it fail. It had already been written. It wasn't released. It wasn't released till later on in history, but it was prepared to be released to the press in case it didn't work. That's how much they were not sure D-Day would actually work. Now, the reason that D-Day worked was because only 20% of the Wehrmacht was in Western Europe. 80% was in the East, trying to hold back the advancing Russian horde, Soviet horde. D-Day would never have happened, at least successfully, if a large portion of the Wehrmacht, the German army, was in Western Europe. And in fact, the things that did make D-Day difficult and the ensuing battle over the next year, especially during the winter, and what happened in the Battle of the Bulge and other setbacks for the Allies, only was possible because of the minimal amount of German army that was present. The rest of them were in the East. Poland, Ukraine, trying to hold back the advancing Russians. Now, I wanted to mention that. I have more to say about this. I wanted to mention Marjorie Taylor Greene, her Facebook post from February 6th, ripping the U.S. useless and failed wars. And she said this: all the narratives are wearing off. Vietnam was a pointless war and we lost. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Afghanistan was a waste and we gained nothing from any of those wars. Saudi Arabia has nuclear weapons and the 19 terrorists from 9/11 were all Saudis. Did we go to war with them? No. North Korea has nukes. Little Rocket Man hasn't blown us all up yet, but we're told he's going to. Pakistan and China have nukes. And big bad Russia has nuclear weapons. We were told Putin was going to sweep across Europe just like Hitler, and that hasn't happened yet either. He couldn't take the Ukraine in 3 years so far. We've been told Iran is on the verge of having nuclear weapons at any moment for as long as I can remember. People just don't care anymore because none of these things actually affected our lives, unless they were in the military and shipped over to these foreign countries to be blown up. But what has directly affected Americans and people that I know is the cartel's constant flow of drugs into every city in America and cartel crime and murder. I have never seen a Houthi, nor has anyone else I know. But what everyone knows is that for some reason we don't attack the real enemy that kills Americans every single day. No, we have to run off and bomb countries somewhere in the world because we're told they're the bad guys, even though they never did anything directly to the Americans like the cartels are doing. Every now and then she says something I find inspiring. So the question that I started the program out with: why was fascism defeated but not destroyed? Why did it continue, especially in this country? Well, I have spent this first hour talking about Moscow and the big celebrations over the victory of National Socialism, in which obviously the Soviet Army had the decisive role. So there is a huge gathering, including 29 heads of state, naturally, Xi Jinping, Lula da Silva from Brazil, many others that are gathering there. This was a very impressive military parade where all the heroes of the Great Patriotic War were named and honored. Now, when you have 27 million killed, I would like, I've been researching, I would just like to see the name Vasily Zaitsev mentioned as one of their heroes. But just to give you a flavor of the spirit, here's a couple of paragraphs from a joint statement of all these various countries that participated in the celebration. Now remember, France and Germany and England weren't there. And there were other European countries that were invited by Putin to participate in this. Because if Russia had not won World War II, D-Day would never have worked. And Europe would be speaking German, probably England speaking German as well. And all these countries refused to attend the celebration in Moscow. But those that did put this together. The parties will resolutely defend the results of the victory in World War II, suppress attempts to falsify its history, belittle and deny the historical contribution of Russia and China to the victory in World War II, denigrate the liberators, and sharply condemn actions related to the desecration or destruction of memorials to those who died during World War II. Moscow and Beijing will make every effort to counteract the increasing attempts to rehabilitate the misanthropic ideology of Nazism and racial superiority, and will continue to jointly oppose the glorification of Nazis and their accomplices, the rise of neo-Nazism, militaristic revanchism, and practices that contribute to the escalation of various forms of racial discrimination, racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance. The parties declare their firm support for each other in ensuring sovereignty, territorial integrity, security, and stability, preventing any attempts by external forces to impede the normal development of relations between the two states and interfere in their internal affairs, the right to independently choose a path of development, and the preservation of cultural and historical identity and traditional moral values. These are the kinds of statements that were made by our founders of this country prior to and during the revolution. Now, these warnings coming out of these various countries that did attend the celebration are not in vain. I mean, one can see by many efforts to completely blend out the reality of what happened in World War II. And they're trying to rewrite history. Andrei Kutanov, who was until the end of 2014 the director of the Russian International Institute of Strategic Affairs, emphasized this attempt to rewrite history by declaring the United States as the main victor. All right, I got to stop my broadcast at K-Talk. My goodness, that first hour went by fast. But I'm staying with my streamers, for sure. So this attempt to rewrite history and to downplay the role of China and Russia, and that how the United States was the main victor, is not historically accurate. Now, it's not, when you see the events that took place Sunday in Berlin, naturally the Europeans celebrating the 8th of May as the end of World War II, there the government made it strictly forbidden. This just happened this last weekend. The German government made it strictly forbidden to show any Soviet or Russian flags. So as a result, you have all of these Ukrainian flags at various historical sites and NATO flags. And the reason given is supposedly Russia has conducted a war of aggression against the Ukraine. Now, I also want to point out a book that was written by Scott Horton. It's a 900-page volume in which great detail documents the 30-year preparation by the United States and the British and NATO for what then became the Ukraine war, including the very aggressive eastward expansion of NATO. It's very, very terrible. I mean, the EU Commission also forbade European leaders from attending the Moscow celebration. And this was ignored by Prime Minister Robert Fico of Slovakia, Serbian President Vučić, who had to make an emergency landing in Baku, Azerbaijan, because of drone attacks on the Moscow airport, which prevented, I think the number was 60,000 people from arriving at their flight destination in time. The opportunity was obviously completely missed, because if the European leaders would have shown any sense of greatness, they would have joined Moscow in the 80-year celebration. They would have invited Russia and Belarus to come to the events in Berlin. But on the contrary, they prevented them and put out an order that they should be chased away if any of them show up. I mean, it was an unbelievable, absolutely horrible forgetting of history. And it's actually beginning to be somewhat of a very worrisome event, especially because the new head of government in Germany, Friedrich Merz, the new chancellor, who, as I said earlier, was elected only in the second round, there was a few dissenting votes that was holding him out that he had to go pay off. In an interview with the second channel of German TV, was asked if he still is planning on sending the Taurus missile to the Ukraine. And he, in a completely nonchalant, as if he were to say, yes, of course I brush my teeth every morning, said, naturally, Zelensky knows that he can rely on me and on Germany, meaning that he is intending to give the Taurus to the Ukrainians. And just to remind you, the German Taurus cruise missile has a range of 500 kilometers, about 350 miles. It can reach the Kerch Bridge to Crimea, which Merz has already named as a target of the Taurus, and if launched further east enough, can reach Moscow. Now, why is the Taurus something better than the American cruise or the British cruise missile? The British cruise missile can't work without American intelligence and guidance, and the American cruise doesn't go as far. And the Taurus can change its trajectory, making it difficult to shoot it down. And so with all that, it could even, as far as we know, it could even have been activated during the celebrations, because it is assumed by experts that given the fact that the geodata of the potential targets in Russia are all well known, you don't need U.S. supply of data from GPS or other space devices, because you already had the possibility to program the Taurus for such a long period of time ahead of time, which does not apply to the other missiles. Only the Taurus is free of U.S. guidance. And if it were deployed, and if it was used by the Ukrainians to fire into Russia, in minutes, it would make Germany a war party and a target of Russian counterattacks. And I don't know how many times Putin has alluded to that, Lavrov has alluded to that, Gerasimov has actually come out and said it, Medvedev has come out and said it. And Merz, as one of his first acts in office as Chancellor of Germany, called up Netanyahu and assured him that the security of Israel is the raison d'être. I mean, the French for reason to exist. The Germany is the reason to exist for Israel. The security of Israel, is the reason for Germany to exist. He came out and said that. An unfortunate formulation which was coined by Merkel some years ago, but he expressed concern about the fate of the hostages and the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza. And he said humanitarianism help should be given, which is a complete utmost cynicism given the fact that what is going on in the Gaza right now can only be compared to what the Wehrmacht did with the blockade of Leningrad at the time, using hunger as a way of ethnic cleansing where the people in Leningrad had no choice, surrounded by the Germans, to leave or die. And this is the fateful situation of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. If we don't reverse this course, we are looking at the danger of a new world war coming either from the situation in Ukraine or in the Southwest Asia or even the Pakistani-India thing, where there's already violations of their ceasefire. And even if it's a remote possibility now, the tensions in the Pacific also theoretically have the potential to lead to a world war. And this is why we have absolutely got to double whatever efforts we possibly can and become a part of the International Peace Coalition that's going to be coming up. I think it's it's at the end of this month. You can get more information about it if you will go to the Schiller Institute and look up and listen to the speakers in this conference. So the fact that the German people, with everything I've just finished saying here, of all people, 80 years after the end of World War II, are not more conscious of the duty that they have from the lesson they have gained from this horror that happened during the Nazi period, would be the first to step forward and do something about this. And the wrong idea that the security of Israel is Germany's raison d'etre, which I said Merkel coined, this idiotic formulation, is just a tragedy, because we are also sending weapons to Israel. I mean, Germany is also sending weapons to Israel, not just the United States. So I think I am going to jump to this ongoing genocide. I just saw some very disturbing pictures of that over the weekend. Mossi Raz, R-A-Z, who's a member of the Knesset and former director of Peace Now, said this: "It seems that the Israeli government has no idea what it wants to achieve in this war. And it is interested in revenge more in solving problems. The Israelis are expanding settlement activity and making small moves toward annexation. If President Trump wants to stop this, he could stop it in 1 minute." Now think about that. How many tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians, and we always pick on the women and the children, because they're usually the most defenseless, especially the children. Thousands upon thousands of dead Palestinian children. And now more and more every day simply from starvation. And President Trump could stop this in 1 minute. All he has to do is call up Bibi. All right, that's enough. Get out of the pool. Go home. We're done. Larry Johnson remarked that there are reports that Trump is sick and tired of Netanyahu and has cut off contact with him. If that's true, it could lead to some wonderful changes. Dr. Danny Ritchie, who's founder of the Community Health Innovations of Rhode Island, gave a report on the Doctors Against Genocide's upcoming press conference, and she said that over 1,000 healthcare professionals have died in Gaza, and the Israelis are targeting hospitals and children. Over 1,000 healthcare professionals have been killed in the last year and a half in Gaza. And she says our tax dollars are funding it, which makes us directly complicit. Doctors Against Genocide have a project called Bread Not Bombs, Let the Children Eat. Later she commented on, it's shocking that a people who once were victims of genocide can now be the perpetrators of it. And what is being done to Gazans were done to animals in the United States. Americans would not stand for it. Oof. Oof. So, just going through the rest of my notes because of all the stuff I put together here before I jump to something else. But I think that I pretty well have it at this point, at least to some degree. This is, yes. The Immortal Regiment, I've talked a lot about that. Oh, this is interesting. This is an op-ed that was in the Baltimore Sun. And it's it's very interesting because this Doug Maluk is a known member of the LaRouche organization. And one thing the press does not do is give any op-ed attention or any interview or anything that could possibly support the LaRouche organization. And they published this letter. And it was May 10th, printed edition of the Baltimore Sun. And it highlighted the irony that the small army of Trump fact-checkers, who normally raise the roof at even the tiniest inaccuracy attributable to the president, said nothing, zip, zero, nada, nothing, when he uttered the mother of all World War II whoppers, namely that the lead role by far in defeating Hitler and company was played by America. Now, this is what Trump said. And what he's saying in this op-ed, where were the fact checkers when he said this? But that Trump had said, by far in defeating Hitler and company was played by America, leaving the Soviet role totally unmentioned. The piece makes clear that this is no mere academic distortion of history, but directly connected to the completely fake narrative on today's Russia-Ukraine conflict, promulgated by many of the Trump watchers themselves. Most surprisingly is that the letter is displayed not in some single column regularly devoted to readers' comments, but rather in the space that's usually reserved for editorials by the Sun itself. It's far and away the most prominent item on the entire editorial page. This is the text, and it's worth me saying this. The editorial is titled, "Trump Got His World War II History Wrong." And the text goes, and this is in May 10th of the Sun, Baltimore Sun. Any falsehood or inaccuracy, real or alleged, enunciated by President Donald Trump is almost invariably immediately met with refutation, rebuke, even ridicule by his media critics and political opponents. Yet when he unleashed a genuine whopper last week, the response was definitely silence. Deafeningly silence. Regarding the 80th anniversary of VE Day, Trump boasted that America had by far provided the leading contribution to that outcome. Not even close. Absolutely, nobody is denigrating the heroic efforts of U.S. servicemen and women and civilians in securing the victory. But in true perspective, the overwhelming brunt of the anti-Nazi fight was borne by the USSR. My father was wounded in Europe at the invasion of Germany. And it was only due to the kindness and humanitarian efforts of a German woman who hid my father from Nazi soldiers that his life was preserved. And I have thanked him many times for the sacrifice he went through. So nobody is denigrating the American position in all of this, but it's what the president said. Now this article goes on. Soviet wartime fatalities at 27 million outweighed U.S. deaths by about 54 to 1. 54 dead Soviet citizens for every one dead American in the war. Soviet losses at Stalingrad alone, close to 1 million, exceeded combined American and British fatalities for the entire war. Even more crucially, some 80% of the total Nazi combat deaths occurred on the Eastern Front, dwarfing any other theater. The far and away biggest, most decisive battles, Stalingrad, Moscow, Kursk, Bagration, were all fought on Soviet soil. The D-Day landing was opposed by approximately 1/5 of the Germany's deployable forces. The other 4/5 were hastily retreating from Russia under heavy Red Army pressure. Imagine if the relative proportions had been reversed. Even Winston Churchill, hardly a pro-Soviet advocate, unreservedly admitted, it is the Russian army that tore the guts out of the German military machine and is holding by far the larger portion of the enemy on its front. So when Trump flatly, wrongly contradicts this undeniable reality, why are his erstwhile fact-checkers so uncharacteristically mum? Is it because his major historic distortion dovetails with their own fake narrative concerning the present-day Russia-Ukraine conflict? Ukrainian officials have reportedly waxed apoplectic at any reference to the American-Russian alliance that defeated Nazism. Kyiv has issued thinly veiled threats to any European leader even contemplating participation in the Victory in Europe ceremonies in Moscow. What else could be expected from a regime that erects statues and monuments to its official national hero, the Hitler ally and anti-Semitic mass murderer Stepan Bandera? With or without their Nazi insignia, the 2025 Banderistas are essentially the same as their 1940s forebears. It's America that has changed. Back then we supported Russia against Nazis. Today, for ugly geopolitical reasons, we've switched historic sides. Trump's effort to end the conflict provokes nonstop rage in the pro-war media, but his recent enormous representation elicits nothing. There's no mystery here. Well, I think that's great. Where's his critics when he says something embarrassingly stupid, like it was America that won World War II? Had it not been for the Allied forces, they would be speaking German today. But to give the Allied forces the credit for what Russia did, I mean, it was Russia that marched into Berlin. It's Russia that took the Reichstag. It's Russia that put up the hammer and sickle flag over the Reichstag. The Americans finally showed up, but they were in a back. They had to take a back seat. That's why Russia ended up with grabbing most of Eastern Europe. All right, now, Scott Ritter's Substack. I usually don't spend my Monday and Tuesday shows reading the works of others, but this is so good that I'm afraid if I don't share this with you, a lot of you will miss out on this. And you know my appreciation for Ritter. There's been a couple of times he said something that it bugged me a little bit, but so little I don't even remember what it was. But this is in his Substack article on May 9th, The Margin of Victory, he calls it. And I have to share this. I'm sorry. On May 9th, Russia celebrates the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany. The United States played a major role in the defeat of Nazi Germany, one the American people should never forget and never stop honoring. But the margin of our victory over the Nazi scourge was razor slim, measured in the lives of millions of our Soviet allies, without whom our collective victory could never have happened. We should never forget their sacrifice. The Battle of Waterloo in June 1815, Napoleon's dream of French glory, was crushed by the combined armies of Great Britain and Prussia. According to Field Marshal Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington and commander of the British forces, the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life, he said. If one or two more battalions of French Imperial Guardsmen had been available during the third and final infantry assault on the British center, the British positions would have collapsed, allowing Napoleon to pivot his army and meet the Prussian forces under the command of Field Marshal Blücher head-on, pinning them in place until the French reserves closed in from behind, an action that would have led to the destruction of the Prussians. But the French had reached the end of their resources, and when the tired soldiers of the British 52nd Regiment of Foot made a last desperate charge, the French Old Guard broke, sending the entire French army into retreat, ending the battle. The margin of victory, he says, was literally a few hundred men in a battle that involved hundreds of thousands on either side. In July 1863, during the Battle of Gettysburg, the 20th Maine, a regiment which normally mustered some 1,621 men, but which, because of the effects of war and heavy campaigning, had been whittled down to 266, was tasked with holding the left flank of the Union line, a small hill known as Little Round Top. Prior to the battle commencing, the 20th Maines were reinforced by 120 deserters from the 2nd Maine, who were given the option of joining the 20th or being shot. This brought the 20th Maine up to 386 men. Facing the 20th Maine were two Alabama regiments, the 15th and the 47th, and the approach march to the position held by the 20th Maine took several hours in the hot sun with no water. Between them, the 15th and 47th Alabama mustered just under 1,000 men, and by the time the men from Alabama reached the base of Little Round Top, they had deployed some 180 men as skirmishers to protect their advance from Union sharpshooters. Another 15 men from the 15th Alabama were sent out to look for water. The men from Alabama charged up Little Round Top 4 times but were repulsed. The 5th charge brought them to within 15 yards of the 20th Maine's positions. Here they nearly broke through. The men from Maine had seen 130 of their number fall dead or wounded. They were running out of ammunition. But the men from Alabama were similarly exhausted, with 150 of their number fallen on the hill. When Colonel Chamberlain, the 20th Maine commander, ordered a last desperate bayonet charge, the men from Alabama broke. If it weren't for the 120 men from the 2nd Maine Regiment who reinforced the 20th Maine at the last moment, Little Round Top would have fallen. If the Alabamans had retained the nearly 200 men they left behind as skirmishers or water bearers, Little Round Top would have fallen. If Little Round Top had fallen, the Battle of Gettysburg would have ended in a Union defeat, and the U.S. Civil War may very well have had a different outcome. Once again, the margin of victory came down to a few hundred men at the right time and place to change history. Throughout the course of history, the margin of victory in battles that shaped world events often could be measured in terms of hundreds, if not thousands, of men whose presence at the right time tipped the scale of fate in their favor. We won 2 world wars, but we never took credit for it. Donald Trump, the 47th President of the United States, recently posted on his Truth Social account. Everyone else does. All over the world, the Allies are celebrating the victory that we had in World War II. The only country that doesn't celebrate is the United States of America. And the victory was only accomplished because of us. Without the United States, the war would have been won by other countries, and what a different world it would be. And I'm still quoting here from Ritter's article. Donald Trump went on to proclaim May 8th to be World War II Victory Day. He also redesignated November 11th, that we call Veterans Day, as World War I Victory Day. The impetus for such a historically flawed statement is not stated by those who issued it, but is apparent to all of us. Trump is jealous of the attention being given to Russia's May 9 Victory Day celebration and is looking to create a competing event which would thrust the United States into the limelight. One of the problems Trump is going to face in generating enthusiasm for his new May 8 holiday is that the American people have long forgotten about the greatest generation and the sacrifices they made for the United States and the world in defeating the dual threats of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. More than 16 million Americans served in the military during World War II, of whom just under 300,000 were killed in combat, with another 670,000 wounded. I will never denigrate the service of anyone who served their nation honorably in time of war. Every American who wore the uniform during World War II deserves praise, as do the millions of Americans who helped turn the American industrial base into the arsenal of democracy. Americans fought the Germans and the Japanese simultaneously, requiring a division of resources and national focus that meant that we could not bring the total weight of our national power down on our enemies. This required a balanced approach to both theaters of conflict where specific timings were linked to manpower and resource availability. The margin of victory was often tighter than would otherwise have been desired. Take, for instance, the D-Day landing in France on June 6, 1944. The United States had been carefully marshaling resources for this event, even as we engaged the Nazis in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. There was no guarantee of victory. As Dwight Eisenhower's statement that he prepared in case of defeat said, quote, "Our landings in the Cherbourg, Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to this attempt, it is mine alone." Well, as history tells us, he did not have to release that statement, because we prevailed on D-Day, but the margin of victory was very slim. And one of the factors that played a major role in successfully managing the margin of victory was the other war, the one most Americans don't know anything about, the war on the Eastern Front between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Those familiar with the history of the Normandy operation may be familiar with Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive against Nazi Germany's Army Corps Center, which unfolded from June 22nd through August 19th, 1944. This is after D-Day. This offensive was ostensibly timed to prevent the Germans from transferring troops from the East Front to Normandy. The Soviets employed a combined force of approximately 1,670,300 combat and personnel against a German force of some 849,000 soldiers. By comparison, Operation Overlord, by mid-July 1944, saw the U.S. and British deploy some 1.4 million troops in France, facing off against a force of approximately 640,000 Germans. By the time Overlord concluded, August 30, 1944, the Allies had suffered some 226,000 combat casualties, the Germans losing 323,000, including 233,000 prisoners of war. During Operation Bagration, which ended on August 30th, 1944, the Soviets suffered 670,000 combat casualties, while inflicting losses of 540,000 killed, missing, or captured Germans. In short, in just 5 weeks, the Soviets had destroyed 22 German divisions. To stabilize the front, Germany had to transfer 46 divisions to the Eastern Front, including several divisions that were supposed to be arrayed against the U.S. and British forces in France. But the real victory of the critical role played by the Soviets in helping guarantee a U.S.-British victory over the Germans at Normandy was the Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, which took place between December 1943 and May 1944. Here, the Soviets lost some 270,000 killed, 840,000 wounded, greater losses than the entire U.S. military suffered, fighting against both Germans and Japanese, while inflicting 380,000 casualties on the Germans. But this isn't the full story. Because of the Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, on the eve of the Normandy invasion, Germany withdrew from France some 46,000 troops and nearly 400 tanks and assault guns organized in some of the most elite combat formations in German military to reinforce German positions arrayed against the Soviets. These were troops that otherwise would have been deployed to counter the D-Day landings at Normandy, making the possibility of Eisenhower having to read his draft defeat statement more possible. Again, the margin of victory was slim. But the Soviet contribution to Allied victory in Normandy doesn't stop here. The German mobile reserves, which were supposed to respond to any Allied invasion, consisted of 6 divisions and several separate brigade-sized units, which were transferred out of Russia to France in order to refit, ensuring that when Germany did respond to the U.S.-British Normandy invasion, it would be using divisions that had been recently torn to pieces by the Soviets on the Eastern Front. The margin of victory for the U.S. and British forces in Normandy was slim, and would even have been slimmer had the Soviets not carried out the twin offensives of Dnieper-Carpathian and Bagration. These 2 campaigns resulted in the Soviets losing more than twice the number of casualties suffered by the United States for the entirety of World War II in both theater of operations. Americans would do well to recall the words of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who noted in a letter to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin that, quote, "It was the Russian army that gutted the German military machine," end quote. And this came at an unimaginable cost. Some 34 million Soviet men served in the Red Army during World War II, while the official death toll for the Red Army in World War II stands at some 8.6 million. The Central Military Archives in Moscow contain the names of more than 14 million Red Army soldiers who died or went missing during the fighting with Nazi Germany. Millions more were wounded in battle. But this is only part of the story. The fight against Nazi Germany took place on the soil of the Soviet Union, the dark earth of Russia, Ukraine, Belorussia, and the Caucasus. Between 15.9 and 17.4 million civilians were killed on Soviet territory by Germany and its allies during the war. These are unthinkable numbers, and they are numbers no Western nation, including the United States, could have sustained under similar conditions and prevailed. Americans and Russians both speak of the importance of U.S. military assistance, Lend-Lease, on helping sustain the Red Army during the critical years of 42 to 43. But Lend-Lease did not win the war. The blood and sacrifice of the Red Army did. As U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt noted in 1942, Russian troops have destroyed and continue to destroy more manpower, planes, tanks, and cannons of our common enemy than all the other United Nations combined. It was the skillful leadership, solid organization, appropriate training, and above all, determination to defeat the enemy regardless of its own sacrifices of the Red Army, which Roosevelt noted in a 1943 letter to Joseph Stalin, quote, certainly forced Hitler's armed forces to follow the path to final defeat and won the admiration of the people of the United States for a long time. A long time, but not forever. Today, a sitting American president denigrates the unimaginable sacrifice of the Red Army and the Soviet people, the Russian people, in defeating the scourge of Nazi Germany. America should, indeed must, honor the sacrifices and accomplishments of its own soldiers and citizens in contributing to the great Allied victory of Nazi Germany, but not at the expense of truth. The Red Army engaged and destroyed between 76 and 80% of Nazi Germany's military machine. I have read and reread Rick Atkinson's amazing trilogy on the history of the U.S. Army during World War II, and I am amazed at just how slim the margin of victory was in many battles fought between the American forces and their Nazi enemy. One more German battalion here, a few hundred German tanks there, and a battle may have gone the other way. But the Germans did not have the resources because 9 million of their soldiers were on and died on the Eastern Front. 9 million soldiers who otherwise would have been available to tip the scales in favor of the Nazi armies fighting in the West. The margin of American victory was slim. And without the sacrifices of the Red Army and the Soviet citizens, there would have been no margin of victory. For the people of Russia, May 9, Victory Day, is a solemn spiritual occasion where the eyes of the 27 million or more ancestors who perished in the horrible struggle against Nazi Germany stare down on the citizens of today, reminding them of the sacrifices they made and challenging them to never disgrace their memory. The military parade is a moment of supreme national pride. It is not, as some in the Western posture, a statement of modern Russian military chauvinism. Instead, the Russian people see before them the progeny of the Russian troops who paraded down Red Square in December 1941, marching straight from the ceremony to the front lines only a few miles away, where they shed their blood to stop the German army that was knocking at the door of the Soviet capital. They see in the soldiers of today the pride of the Red Army when it again paraded at the end of the war against Nazi Germany, flinging down the banners of their defeated enemy. They look at the young men who proudly march today and see in them the same indomitable spirit of their forefathers who gave everything so that the Russian people of today might live in peace on the soil of Mother Russia. Victory Day is not a national gimmick or a narcissistic pleasure for a Russian leader. It's an expression of the very soul of a nation and its people, a reminder that the margin of victory in World War II is measured in the sacrifice of the Red Army and the Soviet nation. Donald Trump seems to have forgotten this truth. It is incumbent upon the citizens of the United States, Britain, Canada, France, and the other nations that comprise, together with the Soviet Union, the great alliance that defeated Nazi Germany. The Russian people have never forgotten or forsaken these allies. Indeed, the Russian army marches in their honor as well. We must never forget the heroism and sacrifice made by American soldiers in defeating Nazi Germany. But the margin of our victory was slim, and only came because of the sacrifice of untold millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians. It is our duty to honor them as we honor our own. Now, I know that was lengthy, but it was excellent, and he's spot on. And it's, you know, it's eye-opening. But more importantly, it's fact-based. This isn't something out of Hollywood. I mean, the description of the contribution of the Red Army to defeating the Nazi hordes. I'm sure many curious people in the world know this. But as a social phenomena, Americans seem to lack the curiosity to go learn the truth and continue to believe in the Western post-World War II propaganda that, of course, is designed to diminish the Soviet contribution and demonize the Russian commies in order to execute the Cold War and now the Hot War with the specific goal of inflicting strategic defeat on Russia and subjugate it for our exploitation of its immense resources. So even though this war in Ukraine has come to essentially an end, because it's only with the continued armament of its people by other nations who are rapidly running out of armaments themselves, and the promise that somehow Germany is going to deliver the Taurus missile, as though that will make any difference. You suppose the S-500 anti-missile system, the most sophisticated anti-missile system on the planet, can't shoot down at Taurus? And the Russians have already made it very clear through Putin and others, if German missiles are delivered to the Ukraine to be used against Russia, that will be we will take that as an act of war against Germany, against Russia. And then we will have German targets. And they've already demonstrated the horrific nature of the Oreshnik missile. So it's a long article. that I just got through reading logically laid out to show that without the Red Army, we would never have been able to defeat Nazi Germany except with the use of nuclear weapons later in the war, say 1945. But there's always those people who come back with that. Well, if the German resistance to D-Day had been worse, Heisinger had already blown up his lab. Heisinger, is that the right word? Am I saying that right? Heisinger. Anyway, the counterpart to Oppenheimer, the German, who had already been working on nuclear development, and then there in 43 just totally destroyed their laboratory, blew everything up. I'm not even sure of the mechanics of the explosion, but it set their nuclear bomb development back so that the Manhattan Project could get ahead of them. And so there are some apologists who come out and say, well, if we had been unsuccessful at D-Day, or if the Germans had continued to be advantageous as they were, we would have had the nuclear weapon, and there would have been more explosions than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, maybe. But just remember this. For the better part of 4 years, the Red Army bore the brunt of the Nazi onslaught, and with colossal losses and sacrifices, civilian even more so than military. And it defeated and fatally weakened the Nazi army to the extent that even without the Normandy invasion by the West, the Soviets would have won anyway. But, perhaps with some delay. Maybe not as quickly as they did, but they still would have won. And the Allies waited until Nazi Germany was fatally wounded before the opening of the Second Front. Now, we don't know if that was done deliberately. I mean, why did we wait so long? Why did Eisenhower, why did the combined Allied forces wait so long for D-Day? Except to see mounting defeats of the Nazis in the eastern part of Europe, and to see more and more Nazi divisions being pulled. I mean, it only makes military sense. Seeing more Nazi divisions being pulled out of Western Europe and sent to the Eastern Front. And so waiting until Germany was fatally wounded, partly because of the fear that Soviets would otherwise occupy all of Europe. I mean, if the Soviets had not launched Operation Bagration by the same time that Normandy invasion took place, Ritter makes it very clear the Normandy invasion would have ended in a disastrous Allied defeat. And for those people who still believe the Allies won World War II, just ask them, who took the capital of Nazi Germany? Who raised their flag over the Reichstag? I think the answer would be obvious even to the most deluded and most conniving of the US, UK, and Europe apologists. So, I mean, there's more that Ritter could have put in there. Discounting the air war and the invasion of North Africa and Italy, let alone the war at sea. I mean, the air war over Europe cost more than 100,000 Allied lives. And those fronts diverted an enormous amount of resources from the Eastern Front and needed to be defeated in turn. But realistically, the Allies couldn't have gone much faster than they did. And obviously, the Allies contributed to the Soviet war effort. But the life and death struggle of this war was on the Eastern Front of Nazi Germany. And this was, this is a real missed opportunity for our president. Why didn't he put in a telephone call to President Putin asking if he could come to Moscow to express on behalf of the American people the respect, the admiration, the gratitude for the Russian people for the great and decisive role they achieved at such great cost in the victory over the German Wehrmacht? Why didn't he do that? Was it his narcissism? Was it his arrogant nature? Was it such that he didn't want to show some weakness through kindness that he thinks he needs to demonstrate here in the coming peace talks, that he couldn't have just called Putin and said, hey, we would have lost a lot more American lives if it wasn't for all the lives of the Russians that were killed. But I think Trump, to some degree, like half the population of the West, is not merely ignorant. There's a level of stupidity that gets into this. Now, I mentioned, or when I was quoting Ritter, I quoted the two battles of where that he brings in. And this is one of the things I just love so much about listening to Ritter on the Napolitano podcast, is how he recounts history. And I eschew war as much as anybody. I hope President Trump is able to pull through with his presidential election promises of ending wars. Of course, he's already started another one, but I hope he's able to do that. But there was a couple other things that I wanted to mention relative to Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. And I've always been a student of the history of war. It actually started with somebody telling me the truth about the Tet Offensive in 1968 and why it failed for the Allied side. And then I have, I think, half of my books. Half of the books I have are on health and healing. The other half are on politics and war. And I'm a very boring person, actually. I don't have a whole lot of interests outside of that. But remembering Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo by a very slim margin. Yeah, it had rained heavily the day before the battle, and Napoleon was one of the things that made his conquering of Europe so effective was he was just a master at rapidly moving and deploying artillery to the devastating effects on the battle. If you saw the movie Napoleon with Joaquin Phoenix and the battle at Austerlitz, and that Napoleon had been involved with artillery before he ended up becoming emperor or becoming in charge of the French forces, how powerful the artillery is, the cannonades, once they're deployed in the right position. Well, the soggy ground delayed the French artillery deployment at Waterloo, and it just wasted precious hours that could have been crucial later in defeating the English and then being able to pivot towards the Prussians. Now, Napoleon was tired in this battle and went to take a nap. This is in the history. Precisely when his subordinate marshals ordered a disastrous cavalry charge against the English infantry without their own infantry support. And so the French cavalry charged and occupied the heights where the English artillery were deployed, but no one thought of bringing iron nails to hammer shut the firing holes of the English artillery. So when the French cavalry eventually retreated, the English artillery resumed its firing at them. Now that's a little known thing I didn't know about. Now in the movie Band of Brothers, the 10-part series of E Company in World War II, there was this battle that occurs in, it's either the third or the fourth episode of the 10-episode series, where the Americans surprise this German artillery unit, and what they do is they immediately take their Semtex or whatever their explosive was, and dropped it down the barrel of the German guns to split them open and make them unusable. But when I was reading the French history here, what you would do back then, because they didn't have, M4 or Semtex or C4 or whatever the explosives were, they would go to the little hole that lit the fuse to fire the cannon and drive a nail down in there a little bit wider than the diameter of the firing hole to make the cannon unusable. Well, they didn't do that. They retreated without doing that, and as they're retreating, then the English artillery pounds them to pieces. And so the French cavalry charges, moves, it occupies the heights where the English artillery was deployed, but because they didn't do that, they got destroyed from behind. Now, Marshal Ney, N-E-Y, a very capable military commander under Napoleon, was sent to block some other troops, and instead of taking the initiative to hurry back and reinforce Napoleon after the battle started, he didn't do anything. I mean, his troops would have been instrumental in wiping out Wellington's army. And you see, under Napoleon, the French army groups always march separately, but rapidly converge on the battlefield to deal a decisive blow to the unsuspecting enemy, being flanked on both sides. And this cardinal rule was violated by Marshal Ney. And then Blucher arrives with his Prussian army just in the nick of time, because a few hours' delay could have made a difference, but a huge number of fresh troops joined the battle and sealed Napoleon's fate at Waterloo. So again, it's a slim margin that made the difference. And it's just utterly shocking how much the American people as a whole, not individually, not you, of course, are just so hopelessly ignorant of this stuff. And when I read this kind of stuff, and especially World War II because my father was in it, and a lot about Vietnam because I was almost in it. I mean, there are people, I mean, you live in the United States, you live in Germany, the news in Germany, there's as much propaganda there as there is here. I told you that story about that Chinese thing, where these Chinese students, I can't remember if it was at a college or where, but they were around a bunch of American students. And when the evening news came on, the Chinese were watching the sports and watching different things, but when the evening news came on, they turned it off. They didn't pay any attention to it. And when they were asked why, and they said, same thing in our country, it's just propaganda. Same thing in China. You have the same thing here you have in China, just tons of propaganda. That's given me a new appreciation for the American news service. But I don't want to see my country slide into a disaster. That there are forces that want that to happen. The Mickey Map thing that Ray McGovern talks about. Military, industrial, commercial, academic, I mean, he names them all. The press, not just military industrial complex, he names them all, who want war. And right now, to denigrate Russia is so wrong, but nothing is taught in school anymore so that people, they don't know how the Russians saved the West from Nazism. And it's impossible not to see the CIA involvement in all of this because, as you well know, the CIA doesn't work for us. And so without the sacrifice of Russian soldiers and civilians, and I'm doing this because I want to play a part in the celebration, the May 9th celebration of the Great Patriotic War. And that, I don't know, my father may have been killed in World War II before I was ever born, had the Russian contingent that he was going up against was as powerful as the one, more powerful than the one that he did. Well, if you are listening for the first time and would like more information about who I am and what I do, you can go to forbiddendoctor.com. I specialize in the upper cervical spine. I change the entire spine's position against gravity, which is why it's so effective against low back pain, sciatica, and such, by only touching the very top bone in the neck, which is not attached to the rest of the spine. But it controls the spine's position against gravity. If you've got a high shoulder or a low hip, if you've got a knee that's bothering you or a hip that just doesn't seem to get any better, that's probably exactly what I'm describing. And the work I do is so effective for that. And I get a kick out of seeing people I haven't seen for months. And they said, man, I was doing so good, and I misstepped or I came back down out of the truck backwards and fell, or whatever, and I lost my correction. I said, well, here, let me take care of you. 1 or 2 visits in there. I may not see him for another 3 or 4 years. My job is to get you out of the clinic. It's not to keep you coming back. I mean, anybody that says I need to see you once a week the rest of your life is not about fixing something. They're about something else. My consultations are free. They can take up to 30 minutes or so while you tell me what's going on, and I'll tell you if I think I can help you, and there's no charge until you decide you want me to take care of you. And you would schedule these through the little chat box on forbiddendoctor.com or call the office, 801-523-1890. I'm going to see a couple of people today that I started on last week that, it's hard for the average person not only to understand the truth of what happened historically on this planet, but to understand the complexity of their own musculoskeletal system, their muscles, their skeleton, and their nerves, how they're all interrelated with one another. And when that balance between them is disrupted or dysregulated to some degree, pain will always ensue, but not just pain, what this does to internal organs and internal organ function, which is why we have a lot of cardiology patients, a lot of digestion patients, elimination patients, infertility patients, patients with skin problems, migraine, headache type things, just all of these, all relative to the human nervous system not working correctly. That's our job, is to rebalance the function, the dysregulation, get it taken care of in the autonomic system between your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems that are pretty well controlled in your hypothalamus gland that is directly controlled by the position of that top bone in the neck under the skull. And until it is restored to its proper position under the skull, everything else essentially is just a good idea. All right. I think that's going to do it for today. I'll be back again tomorrow talking more about, whatever's going to happen between now and tomorrow. And I appreciate your listenership and being a part of my program. I'm going to, looks like K-Talk has already preempted me. There you go. So just the streamers. Thanks for your participation. Thank you for reading that article and helping to educate us about the important Russian effort. I didn't know a lot. I didn't either. I didn't. And then Ritter, just so articulate ever. Wouldn't you like to have had history teachers like this in high school? Oh my goodness. I'll have to maybe talk about my 2 history teachers tomorrow. So thank you for participating in this. I am going to